With the success of Halloween last year, it looks like studios are finally ready to start bringing back our other favorite slasher villains from the 70s and 80s. And since the news is a little light on Halloween Kills right now, I thought of this new series where I check in on the other slasher villains who haven't come back yet to try and figure out when or even if we're going to see them anytime soon. And we'll be starting out with Freddy Krueger, who hasn't gotten his own movie since A Nightmare on Elm Street was rebooted with Jackie Earle Haley in a CGI-filled mess of an origin story almost 10 years ago back in 2010. And the reason we're starting with Freddy is because unlike Jason or Leatherface, there hasn't been a lot of fighting behind the scenes over the rights for A Nightmare on Elm Street. So in my opinion, Freddy is one of the most prime slashers to come back. The last time we talked about him on my channel was earlier this year. I think it was around January or February, and at that point in time, the rights for the franchise were just sitting on a shelf over at Warner Brothers. It's crazy to think about, but Halloween making $250 million and Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund both saying they'd love to come back and do at least one more movie wasn't enough to inspire Warner Brothers to get started on a new Nightmare on Elm Street. The reality of the situation is that Warner Brothers wasn't really interested in bringing Freddy back because they've been way too busy making money hand over fist on the Conjuring universe and its many spin-offs. And that's just on top of all the Stephen King properties they've collected over the past few decades that are all also making a ton of money, like It Chapters 1 and 2. And look, I know there's an argument to be made that horror is hot right now, so bringing Freddy off the shelf almost can't fail, but you have to look at it this way. So if you have a movie like Ma or Truth or Dare, those movies are guaranteed to make their money back because they only cost $5 million to make. All they need to pull in over their lifetime run is $15 million to be profitable. But say you work over at WB and you just spent over $100 million on It Chapter 2 and you didn't get the money back you wanted, and you also spent $40 million on a sequel to The Shining and Dr. Sleep, and that made $14 million in its first week at the box office, you're going to be a little bit more careful with what movies you're pulling off the shelf and giving the budget they need. And then on the other hand, you have the Conjuring universe, which is not only cheap to make, but also supports 2 movies a year that are basically guaranteed to make their money back. It makes a whole lot more sense why they would want to keep Freddy on the shelf for a rainy day when they can stop squeezing every last penny out of that franchise and people get sick of it. But even with all that happening at Warner Brothers, there's been some stuff happening behind the scenes with A Nightmare on Elm Street that makes me think we might see a movie sooner rather than later. The first thing we have to talk about is the rights issue, and for that we're going to have to take a quick detour into Camp Crystal Lake and look back on the lawsuit that's been plaguing that franchise for the better part of the past couple years. The root issue with that lawsuit is that Victor Miller, the guy who wrote the original Friday the 13th, is trying to take advantage of a law that allows screenwriters to regain ownership of their screenplays after 35 years. It's pretty complicated, but the long story short here is that if he gets the rights back to Friday the 13th, he also gets the rights for characters like Jason Voorhees and Pamela Voorhees and the location of Camp Crystal Lake, and on top of that, he might be entitled to back pay that the franchise has made over the past few decades. Oh, and if they make any more Friday the 13th movies going forward, he'll be entitled to money on those too. And then on the other side, you have Sean Cunningham, who's been with the franchise from the beginning. He's basically saying that it's changed a ton since the first movie, and he made it what it is today. And on top of that, Victor Miller was his employee when he wrote the script, so he doesn't owe him anything. So of course, they keep going back and forth suing and countersuing each other, and it's just a huge mess, and that's why we're not seeing any new movies, and that's also why we haven't seen any new updates to Friday the 13th the game. And the reason that's relevant here is because November 9th, 2019 is actually the 35th anniversary of A Nightmare on Elm Street. But thankfully, things are a lot easier with this franchise because Wes Craven both wrote and directed the original movie, which means theoretically he could take back the rights to it uncontested. And I'm saying theoretically because as every horror fan knows, Wes Craven unfortunately passed away back in August of 2015. But as it turns out, according to my friend Brad over at Bloody Disgusting, Wes Craven's estate was able to reclaim the US rights for the franchise, and Warner Brothers didn't argue because they still own the international rights for it. What I think it basically means is if Wes Craven's estate decided to make a new Nightmare movie with Universal instead of Warner Brothers, Universal would get to distribute it here in the United States, but they'd have to let Warner Brothers distribute it overseas, and they'd each collect profits on it accordingly. And while at first it seems like something that can never happen, it's actually not unheard of. A great recent example is M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable trilogy, which wrapped up with Glass earlier this year. Okay, so back when Shyamalan was making Split with Universal, he decided he wanted to throw in a cameo from David Dunn at the end. But since Unbreakable was released by Disney, he had to go ask them for permission. So Shyamalan went over to Disney and asked them, and they said, sure, you can use them, but if you make a sequel to Split, we want to be involved in it in some way. So when Glass eventually came out earlier this year, it was distributed here in the United States by Universal and overseas by Disney. When it comes to A Nightmare on Elm Street though, I'd assume that the estate would just go with Warner Brothers either way, because splitting up the rights to the franchise doesn't really make a lot of sense if you don't have to, and Warner Brothers is kind of the king of big budget horror right now. Another good sign here is that filmmakers are paying attention, and some of them have already thrown their hats in the ring. One of them is called SpectreVision. They're actually one of my favorite horror production companies right now, and they're owned by Daniel Noah and Elijah Wood. They've only put out a few movies since they started in 2012, but if you've seen Mandy, Color Out of Space, or Cooties, you know they know how to make a good horror movie. And around Halloween this year, ComingSoon.net sat down with Wood and Noah and asked them to put together a list of their top 5 dream horror projects, and one of the movies they listed was A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a bold move for sure, and it might not go anywhere, but I think it was smart and cool of them to use the platform they were given to say, hey, we're interested in this and we have some ideas. Noah said he's been in touch with the right holders many times and he has a very specific idea of what they'd want to do with it, and Wood followed him up by saying he likes the franchise because it can reinvent itself. What I found really interesting though was that they said they'd want to explore other neighborhoods in the universe and not just make the same movie we've been seeing over and over again for the past few decades. They really came prepared for this interview because they said they already have a director in mind, and his name is Adam Egypt Mortimer. He directed their new movie Daniel Isn't Here. I haven't actually seen it, but it premiered at South by Southwest earlier this year and people absolutely loved it, and some of the reviews even said that it seemed like A Nightmare on Elm Street inspired it, so that's pretty cool. And honestly, if they are thinking about bringing this franchise back, I want the movie to be new and unique and fresh, and not just another goofy origin story that we've already seen that nobody asked for. Really, the thing I've always loved about A Nightmare on Elm Street is that they don't tell you how Freddy got his powers. I think that makes him way more terrifying. I mean, sure, we know he was evil when he was alive, and we know why he wants to take revenge on the adults on Elm Street, but we don't know exactly how he's able to get into teenagers' brains and kill them from the inside out. That's what makes him one of the most terrifying slasher villains, in my opinion. So if the people at SpectreVision want to bring Freddy back and have him just start showing up in other people's dreams who don't live on Elm Street, I think that would work really well. And I know there's the whole revenge element on Elm Street, and it's even in the title, but the idea of him being powered by people being afraid of him and knowing who he is and expanding out beyond one square block of a street is just so terrifying, because that means he could come for you. And if they wanted to bring Robert Englund back, all they'd have to do is have him start out old and withered because the teens of Elm Street forgot about him. So he expands out, starts killing people who live outside of that street, and people become afraid of him, and when he regenerates and becomes young again, we have a new actor playing the role, and that's who plays him going forward. Either way though, the idea of Freddy coming back is exciting because it actually seems possible, especially when you compare it to Jason coming back, which looks like it's never going to happen. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Let me know who you think should play Freddy down in the comments below, and also subscribe if you haven't already. Anyway guys, my name is Jimmy Champane, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.